Welcome to another Wednesday's Word. My name is Tim Schaaf. I'm the pastor at Cascade Christian Reformed Church in Marysville, Washington. And every week we take time to look at a different part of the Bible. We've been following the daily audio Bible this year and just finished this morning the book of Ephesians. Ephesians ends with, when I was a kid, one of my favorite passages in the Bible about the armor of God. I grew up as a real geek reading lots of comic books, stories about King Arthur. And so when you got to a place where I got to have a sword and shield, I was pretty excited. I spent probably way too much time drawing the sword of the Spirit and the shield of faith and all these things as armor. That's something that Hector or Roland or Galahad or Lancelot would wear, instead of really thinking deeply about what they meant. But that's what kids tend to do. But that imagery grounded deep in me. Even with all that time with imagination, I was able to take that and realize that we're not called to a passive life. We're called to something that's real and a little bit dangerous, if you would consider that. We're not called to be crusaders going out into the world using guns and sticks and swords to bring the gospel of peace to people. There's a comic book character in the DC world named Peacemaker, and his name's Peacemaker, his symbol's a dove, and one of his catchphrases is, "I love freedom. It doesn't matter how many people I have to kill, how many men, women, or children I have to kill to bring about freedom and peace. I will do it because I love peace." That's not our calling. We're called to be people of peace. But in that peace, there are times when love means that we wage war. And our warfare often is against principalities and powers. At the end of Ephesians, it says that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wage war against the spiritual realms, against the principalities and powers that are seeking to capture this world. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul will also write, we read this a little while ago, that even though we live in the world, we don't wage war like the world does. Instead, we don't use worldly weapons. We don't need nuclear bombs and cruise missiles and all that. We use spiritual weapons to take every thought captive. We demolish strongholds and arguments. And so there's two parts to our warfare. One of them is spiritual. And so we're called to be people of prayer. One of the biggest battles we can fight is in prayer. When I was in Hope College, we were in a spiritually dead place. We could see secularism coming in. People on the religious faculty weren't believing that Jesus was the only way to salvation. The Bible was an old historic document to be picked apart by scholars, not a living thing. And we would do prayer marches. And we weren't like Joshua at Jericho blowing trumpets. We would just quietly walk through the chapel, walk through some of the classrooms and pray. This would be after dark when no one else was around. The only person who saw us were each other and God. But we would pray that God would do something, that he would take this college back. And within a few years after I'd graduated, God did. There was a mighty revival at Hope College, one that I believe still has repercussions. Last time I visited, at least, the chapel was overflowing. Worship was alive. There was a growing body of people who passionately loved the Lord, both in the faculty and in the student body. So that's a big part of our battle is prayer. The weapons of in the armor of God is the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, all these things that we equip ourselves with so that when we think about the world and we bring that world to God in prayer, we can bring the right things and ask God to do more than we could ever ask or imagine. But the other part is taking apart ideas. And that doesn't mean that you have to be a debater. You don't have to pick people apart at the dinner table. But we grab every idea and take it captive. So what does it mean to take something captive? It means that you hold it and you examine it. Imagine you're going through the airport security and you forgot that you have like a metal thing in your pocket. What they're going to do is they're going to pull you aside and they're going to essentially hold you captive to find out what's going on there. I've been pulled aside a few times and they have to look through their bags. One time, one of my nieces, she had this pillow with all these LED lights and it was really pretty. It had a heart and it would shine and just kind of a fun thing. And she's taking it through airport security and they see something about this big that's covered in wires. They pulled it aside. It looked very suspicious. And so they had to inspect it to find out what it really is. And that's what it means to hold every thought captive. It means we take a thought and we hold it up to the light of the gospel and to what the Bible would tell us on how to think about life and say, is this true? We take an idea like critical race theory and is this true? And parts of it would probably be true. We do need to listen. We do need to be empathetic. But there are also are ways of people seeing themselves in victimization, and we can take a look at that. I read an interesting piece yesterday that talked about the mental health crisis in our world. And that's a thought we have to take captive. This was not coming from a Christian writer, but what he was saying is many people are self-diagnosing themselves with things like autism and other things. And I know people well who have done that. They've got self-diagnosed things, and then they use that as an excuse not to get better, to not really work as hard as they could, not to seek the right sort of help. And so take those thoughts captive. What the post was talking about was, how do we examine this and find out if people really are sick? What are the right ways to get people to help? Because if we just run around with self-diagnosed disorders, we never will. So you can take any thought, a political idea, a way of dealing with people, a way of listening to people of other ethnicities and backgrounds and sexualities, and we have to take that thought captive. In a few weeks at church, we're going to be talking about homosexuality, and that's one of those places we have to hold our thoughts captive. Is my knee-jerk reaction to that lifestyle the way God would see it? I mean, honestly, I was looking through some old notes, and as much as I've always tried to be sensitive and welcoming in my language, even though I held to a biblical, what I believe the historic biblical stance on this, I look at and see some of my old writings and topics were really heavy-handed and probably not as helpful as they could be. But then again, I know people who, as soon as they have friends who are gay, they completely change their theology. And both of us have to hold our thoughts captive and say, okay, this is where I think is the truth, but what does the Bible really say? Where's the heart of God on this? And not just what do I assume the heart of God is, because I can assume that the heart of God is accepting of things that I want him to be accepting of, or judgmental on things I want him to be judgmental of. What has he revealed? That's why we study the Bible. And we hold our thoughts captive. And underneath a lot of those thoughts, that's where the principalities and powers are working. Heard a sermon that talked about this and how, we expect Satan, if people believe he's real and his demons, to show up and do something like in the Poltergeist movies or The Exorcist. But really, he would rather not call attention to himself. If Satan showed up and started stomping on buildings, it would be a great movie, but he wouldn't gain much influence. Right now, Satan and his minions, the principalities and powers that we wage war against, have politicians saying that the people on the opposite side of the aisle are the embodiment of everything that's evil. That your neighbor of a different political party or a different religion or a different racial background are everything that's evil in the world. That's a thought to take captive. That's a thought to say, okay, that person who voted differently than me is still my brother. They are not evil. I need to understand where my sister is coming from on this, not just write them off. And spoken as someone who probably has written people off in the past, who is currently being written off by people who just disagree with me on topics like abortion or the salvation through Jesus, or who you vote for in 2016. These things will divide us, and that's the work of the enemy. Jesus is coming to bring true love. And so it looks like prayer. It looks like taking thoughts captive. And there's a lot more to that, but that's all I can share today. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to comment or send me an email. If not, I'll talk to you next week.